Good evening, everyone. My name is Sabine Spohn. I'm part of the Private Sector Financial Institutions Division, and I'd like to welcome you today to a topic to a seminar with a topic that I'm sure is on everybody's mind these days, the impacts of climate change. And what we discuss specifically today is how these are risks, but also opportunities, and how are they related to the financial institution in our ADB member countries. Maybe just before we kick it off, a few housekeeping rules. So we have put everyone on mute, apart, of course, from the speakers. So please, if you'd like to share any comments, have questions, either raise your hands or put them in the chat box. There will be some recording available from the seminar, which we will share afterwards. We're also very happy to get feedback from you if in case you are interested to have further seminars around this topic area, and we can maybe organize some of them next year to come. So then, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Christine Engstrom, the Director, Financial Institutions Division in ADB's Private Sector Operations Department. To kick it off. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sabina, for the introduction to this WFX webinar, and a warm welcome to all of our participants and panelists today. As Sabina said, that today we're discussing climate change and its impact on financial institutions and their businesses. We're also going to look at these challenges in terms of turning them into opportunities to make sustainable changes. Climate change poses risks to the financial sector in several different ways, including to themselves and through their exposure to their businesses and other stakeholders that experience catastrophic losses and natural disasters, which is increasing default risk of loan portfolios or overall lowering values of assets. The fact that some investors hold assets which are vulnerable to multiple physical hazards can put financial stability at increased risk. According to a recent study by Swiss Re, which is one of the world's largest providers of insurance, if unchecked, climate change will reduce 11 to 14% of global economic output by 2050, which amounts to approximately 23 trillion a year. It has thus become imperative for financial institutions to consider climate change-related risks in the way that they do business. Because of these wide-ranging impacts from natural hazards on financial sectors, central banks are now increasingly incorporating climate risk-related assessments into financial stability and monitoring financial institutions' exposure to transition and physical risk. While climate change does pose significant risks to the financial sector and then our clients and customer bases, it also provides opportunities. So financial institutions can play a strong role in mobilizing the resources needed to help green or blue investments, helping with climate mitigation and adaptation. ADB has prioritized climate and disaster resilience along with low carbon development in response to these growing threats, particularly in Asia and the Pacific. We've raised our ambition for climate change financing from 2019 to 2030 from 80 billion to 100 billion, of which 34 billion will be for adaptation. Just in terms of our financial sector work, we've recently approved a $50 million loan to Bank of Huzhou to scale up energy efficiency for MSMEs. We've also done a $35 million loan to Bank of Qingdao, also in China, for blue financing as well too, and supported housing finance in India, which has a greening component to it. But this is certainly not enough, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Addressing the negative impacts of climate change in the financial sector requires concerted and coordinated efforts from financial institutions and policymakers. And from MDBs and DFIs, it requires special innovative solutions and oftentimes structured finance to really make a deal bankable. I'm so delighted today to have panelists from the finance sector in this session to share with us their experience in using opportunities in response to climate and environmental risks. I look forward to this very interesting session, and so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our colleague, Noel Peters, who's kindly agreed to moderate this session. Noel is our Principal Investment Specialist. He leads ADB's private sector operations climate finance team. Prior to joining ADB, Noel has accumulated a wealth of climate finance experience in servicing clients, including major corporations, trading companies, international banks, the UN, national and regional governments, as well as nonprofit organizations. Over to you, Noel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here today. Hello, everyone. Just like to, underpin what Chris was saying with a couple of facts. In 2021, emissions rose by a record 1.9 gigatons to reach 36.6 gigatons. So greenhouse gas emissions are still rising, and a report recently by a group of scientists indicated that 6 of what are called tipping points may have already been reached, and those tipping points can mean drastic climate changes. So the risk is real, and we're seeing the risk manifest, and financial intermediaries and banks are definitely exposed to that risk. But the International Energy Agency has also formulated an assessment that more than $4 trillion US is required to meet this climate change challenge. So the opportunities are obviously immense as well. So I'm pleased to introduce the panelists today. We have Bernard Bartels, who's the Managing Director of ESG Analysis and Scope Group, Carsten Loeffler, who is Head of FS UNEP Centre for Climate and Sustainable Finance, and Sean Kidney, CEO and co-founder of the Climate Bonds Initiative. So I'm going to hand over to Bernard Bartels now, who will start.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and let me just share my screen quickly so that you can see the few slides that I've prepared for this chat. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. So let me just briefly go through the agenda with you. So I want to raise 3 topics. One is, why do we need climate risk analysis? And I think we can close this topic very quickly because everybody knows that we need it and the purpose is also clear. And then I'm going to talk about one particular aspect that we deem very important currently, namely the so-called network for greening the financial system, which is a network that has been created among central banks to better understand how climate risk scenarios ultimately affect economic growth across regions and sectors. And finally, I would like to conclude with some numbers that we've come up with. So why do we need climate risk analysis? First of all, regulation plays a much more important role than maybe a few years back. Financial market participants are increasingly asked and required to use scenarios, to use climate stress analysis in order to measure their exposure. And that is something that is extremely important currently in Europe, but certainly also in other parts of the world, including Asia. And then second, of course, risk management that particularly affects those more that are also not only looking at regulation, but also that have or are exposed to severe physical risks, and that's certainly the case in a number of countries where you reside. And those risks need somehow to be incorporated into risk management systems. We have seen that some institutions have started to do that, maybe even more in including those aspects in their risk management reports than in non-financial reporting. So we see a clear trend. And then also for asset managers next to banks, we also see the case for doing more climate stress or climate risk analysis in order to structure their portfolios. And this is where I think we chip in with this idea that financial markets are driving transformation, and that's a very, very important thing. So why do I want to speak today about the NGFS, the so-called NGFS scenarios? I think a very important contribution from the NGFS is that they distinguish between 3 important scenarios. One is the so-called orderly, another one is the so-called disorderly, and third we have the so-called hothouse scenario. These 3 scenarios differ in terms of the assumptions as to how quickly the world will adjust its carbon intensity overall. In the orderly scenario, they assume that the world will respond rather quickly, so that carbon prices will rise across the globe and will lead companies and households to adjust very quickly. Now, at the moment, I would assume that we are rather already going into the direction of a disorderly situation, because the world has not yet responded in the way that the orderly scenario would actually assume. And that second disorderly scenario asks then for, this second disorderly scenario assumes that we are going to see a steep increase in carbon pricing towards 2030 only. But then this very steep increase will lead to higher losses across economic agents than the orderly scenario, just because the disruptive force of the higher carbon price will lead to higher economic losses. And then third, they have the hothouse scenario, which assumes that there's hardly any change in the carbon price, so that the carbon intensity remains relatively flat. And I'm going to show you how this actually plays out for an economy in a moment. So then in the end, according to these three scenarios, you have three different worlds, and countries and sectors in these three different worlds are completely differently affected. So you may have some European countries that don't suffer that much from the hothouse scenario, because they are not that much affected by the chronic and also the acute physical risks that we see. So they have maybe less acute, less hazardous weather events. Maybe they have a little bit less of a chronic temperature rise, or at least they have lower levels where they come from, while they would be more affected by transition risks, because they need to pay a much higher tax in order to come down with their high carbon intensity. So we do see for a number of Western economies that for them, especially in the orderly scenario and in the disorderly scenario, they face higher cost short term from these transition than from the physical risks that are emerging only later. Which is also why we are having these scenarios for such a long time frame. So we are looking at until 2050, until 2100, just because we need to make sure we understand that in hothouse world scenarios where carbon intensity doesn't change, the economic losses will be extremely high. And that's something that people still don't have that much in mind. They still think about what happens in the next 5 to 10 years. And there, of course, transition-related economic losses are clearly dominating, especially in those countries that have high carbon intensities. And this is exactly what the NGFS is contributing to enrich this debate on what needs to be done and how growth will be affected across different scenarios. One example here is the case of Germany, where you see the three scenarios, as I mentioned before. On the left-hand side, you have the carbon intensity path across the three scenarios, and you see the green line is the orderly scenario, where we easily go down. The yellow line shows you that we will only go down with a delayed path and even observe a slight increase of the intensity until 2030 before there will be this rapid decrease in line with a very high carbon taxation. And then the third scenario, called hothouse, where the carbon intensity remains high until 2050, so it's rather flat. And on the right-hand side, you see the carbon taxation, so the price for carbon that will evolve in line with what I just mentioned. So in the orderly scenario, you would already observe a steep increase over the next few years, while in the disorderly scenario, this increase will only be visible after 2030, and then a lot steeper. So you have this disruptive scenario here, and you can see that also on the y-axis, while this here is rather a linear increase. Nonetheless, I mean, it would assume that by let's say 2025, we are already going beyond 100 euros per ton of carbon, and we're currently at a price of 30. So that's a scenario that people currently seem to assume to be rather unlikely if you speak to NGFS, for instance. So how would these scenarios actually materialize in different countries? And we have done this analysis for a number of countries, including all the OECD and a number of other countries with the NGFS orderly scenario. So let's first of all assume the beautiful world, let's say. And you see already, and this is something that we consider very important, that the growth difference across regions is steep. So if we look at Asian countries only, we observe that the average output deviation is 10 percentage points higher than for the rest of the world. And this is very important to note, because we are here only considering chronic physical risks. So we are not even looking at hazardous local weather shocks and those kinds of things, which usually dominate currently probably the growth impacts in your regions. And this is something that is very hard to put down into those models, because you need to know what will be the growth effect on a local level. And what we have is only growth on sovereign level and maybe sometimes regional levels, but not on a local level. And often weather events are rather local phenomena. So in the end, what we will need in order to get a complete picture is, of course, an idea about acute risks. So acute risks that occur usually on a local level. And this here is only taking into account the temperature shift that we call chronic. So a constant increase in temperature that leads to output losses due to lower productivity and so on. And that's something we consider very important, because it ultimately leads to a situation where countries like in the Asian region are much more affected by physical risks than by transition risks. In other words, what I deem very important to note is that if a bank that is located in Asia assigns a loan to a borrower, it's maybe more important to look at adaptation of the borrower to climate risk and at how this borrower is actually insuring itself against those types of risks, rather than only looking at the carbon intensity, which is something that we are currently rather do in Europe. So here we really have to think about what is the difference between a transition risk and a physical risk, and where one of the two is dominating. And in our view, what we currently observe is that clearly, and I think that's not a surprise, the physical risks are dominating in your region. If we look at the distribution of those risks across sectors, also not surprisingly, we observe today, if we take the average of all countries, transition risks are dominant, especially in carbon-intensive sectors, while physical risks play less of a role. But you then look at one country only, and you consider the different physical versus transition risks, you see that the red ones here are the physical risks. The red one, the physical risks are dominant across all sectors, and it's not the transition risks. And with that, I'd like to stop, and I'm looking forward for the discussion in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bernhard. Very clear and interesting presentation. I'll now pass over to Carsten for his session.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being with you. Very good to be part of this discussion and presentation. Just let me quickly share the screen. How that works. So it would be nice if you just can confirm what you see.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yeah, we can see your screen, but it's not in presentation mode at the moment.
Okay. Just let's see. No. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. Very good. So what I would like to talk about is about the business perspective, business opportunities in particular. What would it mean, and what business opportunities might be available in terms of financing the transition. If you want, you can also say transformation to a low carbon economy, and that includes adaptation, meaning adapting to a warmer world, and we are much into that already. So this is showing where we are right now with the lending portfolio as of today. Many financial institutions already have some kind of a positive impact part of a portfolio, what means basically use of proceeds that provide a substantial contribution to lowering CO2 emissions, or that support adaptation to climate. There's a strong link to green taxonomies, like there's some in Asia, as you all know, the European taxonomy and many others. So that provides already quite a good shopping list what positive impact might mean. And then certainly there's quite a chunk in terms of lending portfolio that is already Paris compatible. There's a large service sector that is not that much relevant for lowering emissions. So that's the easiest example to that extent. And then right now, in many portfolios, we will find quite a chunk of finance that is linked to economic activities that are either in urgent need to decarbonize, or that need to phase out in a structured way over time. And the intention within the financial sector, and I'd like to relate on Mr. Bartel's presentation here, is to get on a Paris compatible path and eventually to climate neutrality over time, in order to have the risk that is attached to a hothouse scenario in check. And by understanding this, there's certainly quite some business opportunities out there. Let me first have a look at the financial institutions perspective. Say, financial institutions, what do they provide? Say, they provide access to capital at a certain cost. What is pretty new in their perspective is the impact lens, meaning what is the impact of their respective financing activities, for instance, to the environment. Can also say to social issues, but let's focus on the environment right here. And that means that financial institutions will have to look into how they make this possible. And that are the points right and left to this bubble, and at the center, it's getting aware of what needs to be done in terms of qualifications on all levels, allocating responsibilities in terms of, in particular on the board levels, defining objectives, ensuring strategic coherence, taking account of more active shareholders, and providing the right incentives internally in order to get it going, so that corporates and finally the transition can get going. There's, I find quite some interesting perspective looking back to the risk management aspects, understanding what the climate-related risks mean in terms of, say, financing or capital cost via clients. Certainly an aspect that becomes ever more important, and that I see coming becoming more and more prioritized on supervisory authorities' agendas. Taking into account future-proofing of business models, how convincing they are, given that there's maybe regulatory changes, given that there's market developments that might all affect the risk position of financial institutions. There's another point I'd like to highlight here that is related to impact. There's more and more financial institutions that put quite a strong emphasis on impact, what is immediately linked to access to capital for non-financial enterprises. And that can be done by products and services that could provide an avenue for clients in order to finance exactly that, what is required to make the transition going. See, this is all depicted on this chart. Don't worry, I won't just go into too much detail here. The basic issue, as I just said, is that there's financial impact on the client level, basically from the already mentioned transition, physical risks, but as well opportunities out there with a consequence finally on the balance sheet and the profit and loss statement. And that means that all this needs to be incorporated in the risk perspective and as well in all lending and other financial activities. And looking at what are the sectors that are most exposed, I don't want to reiterate what Mr. Bartels already shared. There's certainly a few sectors that are most prevalent when you as a financial institution look into, okay, what are the financing opportunities? I would like to remain on this slide for a minute or two, because that is the central point. What are the opportunities and maybe some methodologies or tools that can be employed? When we look at the loan product range, there's a broad range of economic activities, like in the renewable energy sector, like with energy efficiency, or even with adaptation measures, that can be embraced pretty easily in many cases, always given that the regulatory framework, that the economic conditions, i.e. profitability, is sufficiently given. This is done already in many cases, and I'm sure that is across Asia already the case in many economies. Though there's and that is kind of a global fact. There's much more to do, in particular with respect to renewables and energy efficiency measures. There's one aspect that I find very important, and that is, to my understanding, still underrepresented, but it's a point in case where financial institutions can play a big role, and that is financing what is not green yet, but what needs to be greened over time. Let's call it transition finance, meaning that economic activities that are still, for instance, high emitting, and maybe hard to abate, those need quite some substantial investments, what in turn means there's a big business opportunity for financial institutions to just finance those business opportunities and those infrastructure and machinery investments. At the same time, it needs to be considered, and Mr. Bartels alluded to that already to some extent, that risk management will play an ever more important role. In practical terms, that means that the adaptive capacity of finance enterprises, for instance, to changing regulation or to market shifts, need to be considered in a very structured way. And the same goes with resilience versus extreme weather events. Say, what are weaknesses? What is maybe insurance cover available? All those aspects need to be taken into account much more structured, in a much more structured way than maybe before. And of course, it's always related to carbon emissions, what in many places is kind of the easiest metric to look at when one looks at what potential risks might mean. Before I conclude, there's two aspects that I find very interesting and that are evolving more and more, as I see at least with financial institutions in the European context, and that is establishing a systematic client dialogue with a focus on transition and future-proof business models, having in mind that, as I said just a minute ago, what are to identify the business opportunities that are out there with non-financial enterprises, and in order to make good business, and in order to have a very good understanding what the challenges and opportunities are on the client level. And some banks, some financial institutions already is starting to establish advisory services linked to the transition, kind of guiding or supporting, in particular, small and medium enterprises in their pathway or in the path to decarbonize their economic activities. I'm not talking about capital markets products and services, so I'm really happy to see Sean Kidney on this webinar. He's in a much better position than I am to cover this. There's one further slide that I will leave out now. That is about questions that can be asked to clients. So this will be in the slide pack afterwards. And with that, I'd like to hand back to you, please.
Thanks very much, Carsten. Now I'll hand over to Sean.
Thanks, Noel. And thanks, Bernard and Carsten. So you've heard a little bit about the challenge. Let me just add a couple more points about that, then I want to go into opportunities. The two areas of risk that central banks are now describing in terms of the financial system, particularly for banks in the system, are policy risk changes, policy change risk, I should say, and climate impact risk. So just summarize. It's very clear post the Biden climate summit last year that the belief amongst central banks and amongst investors around the world that the future will be green is now established. The shape of the future has been decided. The question merely is the speed of the change. And of course, everyone in the major investors around the world consider a tsunami is coming through, and it's a bit of a challenge to figure out the winners and losers here. So I'm going to say the policy change risk is that there is a change coming through the system, and we're not really sure about who's going to win and lose and how it's going to work and so on. So, but understand something very important. The change is now certain as far as global investors are concerned. It's not a matter of debate. It's merely a matter of picking the winners. And there are some implications for that. I mean, in terms of the 2030 targets that all the major developed economies have now committed to, and not 2050, it's 2030. Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, is highly focused on the 2030 targets, which is essentially a 50% cut in emissions against baselines. There are some things that are now becoming rather evident. For example, methane. If you're following the science, you will have seen in the last couple of years a lot of reports about the difficulty of leakage, fugitive emissions across the methane system. What that means is we are seeing a delegitimization of gas, methane, as a transition fuel, with consequent impacts on countries that are relying on gas for the transition. Israel, for example, has the installation of gas plants as a central part of its climate plan. It's very clear now, in terms of the following science, that actually doesn't work, that the sums don't work because the level of emissions out of methane are much higher than expected because of leakage factors across the pipeline. Thanks to satellite monitoring, we now know this, and therefore achieving the 2030 targets by using gas won't work. Most countries that are looking at this, including Japan, are trying to figure out how to manage the contradiction between their legacy climate plans and their 2030 targets. You will see change, is my point, in some of these things. And that applies to lots of different areas. The level of emissions reductions that we need to achieve to get down to a 50% reduction in 2030 is immense. It's much tougher than it has been if we'd acted 30 years ago. Will people meet the 2030 targets? Probably not. But you can be sure that change will happen and it'll be sharp. That's one. Now, of course, that's a risk for everyone. And we're risk people, right? It's not nothing certain in life, but it's an elevated risk of change. The second thing is around climate impacts. It's quite clear now from the science of the last couple of years that we've lost the fight against climate change. Understand that. 1.5 degrees will be met probably in the next few years. Temperatures will climb to 1.8, probably 2. What we're on a race to do now in terms of the global science is to get emissions down fast enough and to get involved in sequestration activities, increase in forest cover, changes in soil practices, and direct air capture to sequester carbon, those sort of things, to be able to stabilize climate going forward. So that's actually what's going on. So severe change is going to happen now. That's very certain. And just in the last year, we've seen, of course, significant impacts, the droughts in Sichuan and the heat, the floods in Pakistan, and even in Germany, where the Rhine has been so low that it's hampered transport and led to a drop in GDP as a result of the major transport corridor being affected. These are climate impacts, and they will get worse. The climate impacts we're feeling now are as a result of emissions put into the atmosphere 30 years ago, because the latency affected climate. We've actually put in more emissions in the atmosphere in the last 30 years than in the previous 150 years. So even if we stop emissions coal tomorrow morning, we can expect to get another 30 years of increasingly severe climate impact. Now that raises risks, right? What do those impacts look like? Well, clearly there are physical impacts. If you're doing infrastructure development, you now need to be looking at future-proofing your infrastructure against floods, sea level rise, changes in heat intensity, and so on. In a place like Australia or Saudi Arabia, you need a higher tensile strength of your steel because the steel in a railway line is likely to buckle in consecutive weeks of 60 degrees Celsius heat, for example. There's also a social impact, because what we know, and we learned from the pandemic, which is as a result of pathogens jumping between species as a result of collapsed biodiversity, is that we have much more in the way of impact to our societies than just gently rising sea levels or hotter temperatures. It will mean disruptions as crises come through, like pandemics, predicted by the IPCC Health Committee for the last 30 years to be frequent during this century, where we need to figure out how to recover our societies and get back to work again once we, hopefully, cross fingers, get on top of them with vaccinations and the like. So that's another area of resilience we need to now start thinking about. And fundamentally, it's economic resilience. What we're really entering is an era of volatility, of heightened volatility, both economic, physical, of course, and for banks, financial. And what central banks are concerned about, and there's a great quote from Frank Elderson, who used to be the head of the network of greening the financial system, the association of 100 central banks around the world, that the past can no longer be a guide to the future because of the nature of the world we're heading into. And so what the NGFS did is develop scenarios, 4 different scenarios for what the future might look like, to allow central banks to start thinking about optimal regulatory environments to manage the volatility going forward. Now, every corporation has to do that. Every bank has to do that now. The past can no longer be a guide to the future. We're not certain what the future is, but we've actually got a lot of science. We can make some predictions of what's likely based on what the science is doing. But if you want to figure out how to allocate capital expenditure going forward, you now, as a board of directors and a senior management, need to be across the likely changes that are coming through. So that's a critical thing. I want to stress that it's not just climate as we understand it, as increasing temperatures and so on. There are other aspects to that too. I mean, biodiversity collapse is intimately linked to climate. We're in the middle now of the 6th great extinction, where of the 60,000 tree species on the planet, 20,000 are endangered. 20,000. That's a third of them are likely to disappear sometime in the next 10 to 20 years unless we take action. And that applies to insects, that applies to animals and so on. This is a terrifying prospect for the planet. Now, that's linked to human impact and to climate change. Not entirely, but it's certainly all part of the same thing, in the sense that a healthy ecosystem is absolutely essential for us to be able to survive climate shocks that are coming through. And of course, biodiversity collapse leads to things like pandemics. Just one stat for you. Of the mammalian biomass on the planet now, that is the mammals that exist, 4% are wild, only 4%. 34% are humans. That is a third of all mammals on the planet are humans, and the rest are livestock, 62%. Now that is a change in 100 years. That's not necessarily a viable breakup of mammalian biomass, certainly in terms of biodiversity protection. Now, the solutions, we're reasonably, if you start poking around at this, the solutions are pretty available. There's no real problem. There's plenty of R&D we can do to improve the financial viability of solutions, but we're sort of pretty clear what to do, at least from a science perspective. The capital cost to address these changes is fairly substantial. I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive than Bernard earlier. According to McKinsey's statement or paper in January this year, they say that we need to be investing $9.2 trillion US a year on mitigation alone. And I'm going to say that resilience measures, improving our ability to be able to cope with shock after shock, is going to be around another $5 trillion a year. That's a pretty large capex pipeline, if you like. The good news is about 2/3 is changing existing procurement. You know, if you're building transport, build a railway line rather than a freeway. If you're building water infrastructure, make sure it's adaptation ready and reduces emissions, etc. So but there is nevertheless a capex lump. The good news is we have capital. We're surfeit of capital on the planet at the moment. We've been very successful at creating savings pools in places like Japan, China, Europe, and the US, and even in places like Zambia, where the Zambian pension fund is actually very large. It's just deployed in the wrong place usually. It's deployed in legacy and old types of investments, not future investments. And if you take the central bank's idea that the future can no longer be a guide, sorry, the past can no longer be a guide to the future, we've got to change our thinking in that area. We're not going to change it organically. So what is happening now is you're seeing a lot of public sector money being allocated to preference green to make it easier for, let's say, the governor of Jakarta to choose green over brown. I mean, the Asian Development Bank, for example, has a whole collection of credit support tools now that are available, green credit support tools. Every rich country is rolling out a green bond guarantee, etc. Which takes me to bonds, actually. We've got a proof that investors want to invest this. We've got about some $130 trillion of institutional investment capital in the world who've been signing statements saying they want to see the change, they want to invest in a more sustainable future. And whenever we issue fixed income instruments that meet their risk yield requirements and also address climate, they sell out. We have over subscription rates that are 2 to 4 to 8 times vanilla bonds. That's the indicator that investors will move. But of course, we still have to package stuff. They're not going to take a harebrained bet on something. They still need to meet their fiduciary duties, risk yield. So our challenge, well, this is Asian Development Bank's challenge, and every development finance institution in the world, is to structure, to support companies and countries and governments looking for capital so that they can take advantage of this, which is essentially means structure deals to meet risk yield requirements that also address climate change. That's the opportunity. And I can tell you, money will flow. So what sort of things does this mean? Well, we know that there are a few things already happening. Renewable energy costs are dropping like a stone. And that's because of strong state action by Germany with a feed-in tariff in 2001, and then China that started the largest procurement plan for renewable energy in history and continues every year to invest more in renewable energy than any other country in the world. As a result, they've managed to support large-scale production volumes, which has driven down the price. Everyone else is now taking advantage. Renewable energy costs will continue to drop. In solar, 20% per annum we expect. 20% per annum? Did you know that Aqua is building solar at 1 cent a kilowatt hour in Saudi Arabia now? 1 cent? Like, this is extraordinary. A coal plant in India still costs 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour to run. Game over. The only area where you're seeing coal is where there are government support mechanisms that preference coal, like in Indonesia, over renewable energy. And gas is moving in the same direction. We have Republican municipalities in the US who don't believe in climate change, who are abandoning gas plants, building solar because it's just cheaper. And that's a corridor. So in a way, that's more or less over, but of course we've got to achieve the change. There are implications going forward. Hydrogen prices, as a result, there's green hydrogen developed for renewable energy are dropping like a stone. I've had the CFO of Adani on one of my webinars recently talking about how they're going to be offering green hydrogen at 97 cents a kilowatt hour in a couple of years' time. 97 cents a kilowatt hour is earth-shatteringly cheap. That has implications for fertilizer production in India, where the government subsidizes or gives out free fertilizer. This is really important now. The gas prices are high. They need reduced cost. It has implications for shipping. The government of Singapore is now examining the issue of changing their fuel supply depots from bunker fuel to ammonia generated by green hydrogen. At the moment, there's an investigation underway, and the shipping companies are considering a shift. And it has implications for industrials, where something like 3/4 of all steel plants in China, Europe, and Japan are coming up to the end of life the next 7 years, they've all got to be changed. Now, are they going to be changed to more coal? No, that's good. Are they going to be changed to gas and lock in 30 years of emissions? Well, that's what they're currently talking about. Or are they going to go to be using green hydrogen, which is now developing a momentum? You can see how change is happening. But of course, it affects everything. Food production. Singapore has a target of generating 30% of its. Sorry, I'm going over. My apologies. Let me finish up.
Finish up.
Look, there are so many areas of change: food, forest protection, aviation, industrial. The main point is everything is coming to change, which affects corporates and banks in the area. You've got guidance for what's going to change coming up through taxonomies of sustainable finance being developed already out now in Europe, in China, in Singapore, in Vietnam, coming through in Thailand and India, and so on. We know that things like critical minerals for the transition are opportunities for every country, but we also know that volatility is a norm. So for a bank, this is a real issue. How do we manage an increasingly volatile environment, including debt costs that are way up now and will come down again going forward? That's really the challenge. If you're not on top of that, you're missing a trick. If you are on top of it, you've got a very good chance of spying extraordinary opportunity given the CapEx pipeline that's coming through. Noel.
Thank you, Sean. So I'll just quickly summarize what we heard from the speakers today. We heard Bernard talk about the three scenarios which have been modelled, the NGFS scenarios which Sean also spoke to: orderly, disorderly, and hothouse world. You may have heard Sean refer to four. The fourth is a too little, too late, but that wasn't modelled. So that's some background there. Then we heard Carsten talk about opportunities. He talked about loan products, client dialogue, which I think is really valuable, and touched on capital markets, but then referred that to Sean. And then from Sean, we got what I would call a 124 elevator pitch on climate. We heard that we've lost the fight for 1.5, and it'll probably reach 1.8 to 2. I think if we get to 2, we'll be lucky. He talked about future proofing and the opportunities that are there. He trumped my 4 trillion figure with a 9.2 trillion and 5 trillion figure from McKinsey. And I thought they're all very interesting talks by the speakers. So we did get a few questions in, and I'm just bringing them up. I think the first question goes to perhaps Bernard, which is, can you please elaborate how transition risk shall impact banks and financial institutions?
Yes, sure. Very briefly, I think what is key is to understand, first of all, that transition risks are certainly more important across countries within the developed world, where we have these high carbon intensities, not only in production, but also in consumption. And those need to be addressed. While in other regions, like in Asia, let's say apart from China, Japan, the risks are rather physical than transition related. Nonetheless, also here we observe transition risks that could be direct through the direct and immediate carbon intensity of borrowers, but it could also be indirect risks. And that means you are, for instance, you're serving or you're delivering to another corporate that is very carbon intensive, or you're sourced from carbon intensive activities. So whenever you are when you're lending to sectors with a presumably high carbon intensity, be it direct or indirect, this will be important for you to consider, because either there will be maybe a carbon taxation in your own region, or there will be more carbon taxation in other regions with some feedback effects on the corporates that you lend to. So transition risks are twofold. One, direct through carbon taxation in your own region, but also indirect from maybe less consumption due to higher carbon taxation in other regions, or carbon taxation in other regions that lead to problems in the supply chain.
Thanks very much. So I have a question which could probably be answered by Carsten or Sean, but I'll throw it to Carsten. Could you give some insights on key differences between green financing and climate financing? Examples on criteria eligibility for climate financing would be welcomed. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a very good question. Usually climate finance is just seen as a subset of green finance because it's all linked to environmental issues. Though it has the highest urgency right now, maybe next to everything that is linked to biodiversity, because that's a pretty much overarching topic. Certainly, climate is most pressing, as shown again outlined, yeah, very nicely. When it comes to criteria for yeah, how to look at and how to operationalize green finance. First step is to make use of taxonomies, green taxonomies. Those taxonomies tend to define a green performance, and it's an easy way to save transaction costs and to have quick access to what would be deemed as green. And there's already quite some examples of that, in particular in the climate mitigation and climate adaptation space, and more so on it. Sean already talked about some examples in the Asian region. I would like to point out as well that the Asian countries defined quite a convincing umbrella taxonomy perspective. I think that is very valuable and yeah, very much kind of ahead of the curve. There's other approaches that I'd like to quickly highlight. What is linked to quite some financial institutions now coming forward, in particular with respect to TCFD-related reporting, with sectoral decarbonization pathways that are related to their respective lending portfolios. So we see quite some large, at least European banks in the past, say, 12 months or so, coming forward with analyzing high impact sectors and publishing their respective decarbonization targets, objectives for those sectors, with the aim of decarbonizing their lending portfolio over time. And the second aspect is to measure alignment with the Paris objectives, i.e. the mitigation objective. There's some ideas how to measure that. I shared a link in the chat where there's at least a discussion paper providing an idea how that could be done. Because so there's kind of an objective set, but then it needs to be measured. And this is still in its infancy, how it can be done in a convincing way. If you allow, I'd like to add to the point with respect to data. There's increasingly push by supervisory authorities to get financial institutions started to collect data directly from the clients. I mean climate and environmentally related data. That is a clear outcome, at least to my understanding, from the ECB stress test, showing that the use of proxy data was not that much appreciated. So I think that's a very interesting development. And by that, we will see the data issue maybe solved quicker than we initially thought.
Thanks, Carsten, and thanks for the link. Actually, that's extremely useful. I think it'll be useful for us as well. Sean, was there anything you wanted to add to Carsten on that one?
You know, look, I would just simply say on the data side, this is a fast-moving area. You know, we're a member of the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, for example, with Bloomberg, Refinitiv, S&P, and others. And there's no doubt that data provision is growing fast, but you know, what do we actually need this data for? We need to try and figure out what's to do and what not to do. That's really the key aspect of it. The taxonomy does make things simpler. right? Like the specific taxonomy is saying, look, you don't need to work out the footprint of this particular widget because the work at a government level has already been done to say that widget qualifies. So if you produce that widget, hey, folks, that qualifies. And we'll probably get access to incentives like an ADB credit enhancement, for example. So that's how taxonomy works, simplifying and making it easy for everyone. I mean, under the hood, it's complicated. Of course, it has to be, but it ends up being a shopping list for the future. So if you're looking for high-level understanding of what kinds of things need to be prioritized or are being prioritized in the future, that's the first place to look. Essentially, it's a lower risk universe. If it's taxonomy, it's less likely to be negatively impacted by policy changes going forward, and generally is designed to try and minimize the risk of being negatively impacted by climate impacts. That's all. I mean, it's all relative, right? So investors are using taxonomy now as a universe of investments to preference going forward. So those tools are out there, everyone. You can use those. That is, you don't need to necessarily figure out for your corporation or your SME, for goodness sake, which is really hard, how I justify my position, what I'm doing in some detail. You can simply use the tools that are provided by regulators out there. That's important because, look, if we don't make this simple and easy, the change won't happen. If the cost of transaction, let's say, is complicated and elevated, this is going to be like mud. So a really important thing for us to do, at least when we're thinking of the architecture of the system we're trying to manage, is to provide clarity of guidance, provide cheaper capital for green so people can just simply make a financial decision, don't get, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have a chance of getting those emissions down by 2030.
Thanks, Sean. I guess in developing countries, our DMCs, those regulatory tools aren't there. They're there in China and in ASEAN +3, but
Vietnam coming through in Thailand, Indonesia,
yes,
India. There's a few.
Yeah. But there's still many countries we work in where that's quite a long way off. But I just thought I'd make that point.
But Mongolia has a really good one. Kazakhstan has a putative one. And of course, the key thing is that the work, for example, we've done with China and Europe on the common ground taxonomy, which is what it sounds like, the common ground between China and Europe, is a reference for any country that wants to have a look at those sorts of things. So even if you don't have a tool in Cambodia, you've got tools available to you. Is the key point.
Sure, yeah. So there was a fairly long question in the chat, Bernhard, that you responded to in the chat. Did you want to elaborate on your response? And it was around. I won't read the whole question out again because it'll take me about 5 minutes. But if participants want to understand the question, they can read it in the chat. And it's from Eleanor.
Yeah, I think very briefly, a very good question and something that bothers people around the globe. And I think it ties very well to what has just been said on data, namely the question for financial institutions on how to report consistently on their portfolios. And this is a question that can only be addressed if we know that the borrowers do provide the information in a systematic way and in a consistent way. So, and we are not only talking here about the level of emissions or the level of carbon intensity of a corporate, we are also talking about what are the plans to manage those risks going forward. And that's something where we don't look at financial institution in the first place, but we are looking at the corporates. We are looking at the borrowers, right? And if the borrowers come up with these paths towards towards less carbon intensity, towards net zero, then this can be also used by the banks effectively in order to do the reporting in a similar consistent fashion. I think we are not yet there, but we also know it goes in a fast way. For me, another very important thing here is to, again, distinguish between what we observe in an Asian region and what we observe in Europe. In Europe, it's all about carbon intensity reduction. I think in Asia, there is more focus on adaptation. There's more focus on what needs to be done in order to, build houses in a way that they are more resilient to weather events and to flood risks and so on. Maybe that is a more important focus here, and maybe also in reporting, so that the collection of data from borrowers relates more to adaptation than to mitigation, if you want to say so. But that's my personal take with regards to to the taxonomies in Asia versus Europe. Maybe there should be a stronger focus there on adaptation.
Thanks. I do have another question from this session, but we did get a couple of questions through the questionnaire that we sent out, and I think I might ask one of those because it actually relates to the discussion that we're having on taxonomies. And the question is, which one should an FI apply if there is no national one available? And I'm not sure who would like to volunteer the answer for that one. So
let me dive in, if I may, Noel, because we're working on so many of them. Where do you want to raise capital? Is the first question. If you want to raise capital in the European market, you need to look at the European taxonomy, because investors are governed by that particular taxonomy. So that's one question. If you want to raise money in Cambodia, then a taxonomy is not a regulatory instrument. You don't have to have a licensed taxonomy, but there are useful tools. The ASEAN Taxonomy Board, for example, which is made up of all the central banks of ASEAN, has developed guidance around transition taxonomy. Or you can use the common ground taxonomy between China and Europe, which, by the way, is being referenced by the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. There's a lot of collaboration. And to pick up on the other questions, it looks crazy out there. Everyone's got a taxonomy, but actually the underpinnings are much the same. The G20 taxonomy principles are being applied pretty well everywhere. There's a lot of common ground, a lot of basic frameworks. But of course, yes, if Indonesia wants to govern domestic or provide guidance to domestic institution, they do a taxonomy in Batik. Of course they do. And that applies in every country around the world. So you've got that kind of tailoring to local conditions. Or when Colombia did a taxonomy, they added a lot for agriculture, which is, something like 50% of the world's flowers are in Colombia. The Europe has got nothing on agriculture yet. They haven't got to that. So they clearly wanted to add to the European taxonomy a whole section on land use and agriculture. So there's a bit of difference around the world, absolutely. But there are tools in your region. Just if you look at Asia, there's China, there's a variety of ASEAN opportunities, there's India, and Japan has guidance in the Ministry of Environment, Green Bond guidelines already as well. So there's lots and lots of tools. You will see over the next 6 months, or 8 months probably, the increasing guidance which allows you to integrate all the taxonomies through a single tool. We've got a lot of companies. Singapore has commissioned a company to do that, for example, to provide a tool available for the sector. So tools are coming through. But in the meantime, there's a lot out there you can use. And just my second point, picking up on what Bernard said, adaptation and resilience. ADB has done some excellent work out of its climate change team on the need to address adaptation and resilience. It's a developing area. Certainly in the European taxonomy, there's a lot already about adaptation and resilience, but we need more work on that area. And certainly at Climate Bonds, we now have a large project fleshing out the kinds of investments, the material to improving resilience. And of course, we're talking to ADB's climate team and the climate team of the finance institutions about that. So you'll see more work coming through on that over the next year.
And certainly, if you're working with ADB on financing, we're also here to support you and advise you on that. I might just drop that one in. There's one more question from the survey, and I'll leave that till last. I have a question from the chat, which is, how do financial institutions apply or comply with sustainable finance? I'm not sure who'd like to take that one. Maybe Carsten for that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. See, it's a mix of, say, mandatory and voluntary efforts or requirements right now. See, there's guidance by some, say, central banks and supervisory authorities that though it's just a guidance, it's meant more seriously than just a guidance in many cases. And that is, kind of applied by financial institutions very seriously. In some cases, there's listing rules, for instance, like in the UK on the London Stock Exchange, that relate to mandatory disclosure that is related to the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. What is then linked as well to finance emissions reporting, like with a tool that is called PCAF, that maybe many of you know. Having said that, there's a number of voluntary commitments out there on an international level, like as has come out of Glasgow, COP26 last year, the Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero, G funds. There's national commitments that, where financial institutions actually say, okay, so we want to decarbonize our lending portfolios over time. So usually the target date is around 2050. And then when it comes to applying this, the standard has become that financial institutions follow the recommendations by the TCFD, and that addresses the strategic level, the governance level, the risk level, and the reporting level, and that is quite a comprehensive piece of work that essentially gets into all the parts of the financial institutions in order to get it going. And then we are back to what I've talked about earlier, about how to make it effective in terms of setting goals, setting objectives, defining metrics, and then most importantly, the dialogue with clients and financing solutions. That is key. You can measure everything you want, but you need to take care of your business, of your core business, in terms of finding the assets and then promoting the assets that are low carbon and at the same time that are profitable. And wherever that is not yet the case, there's also increasingly so that financial institutions flag this, because essentially financial institutions are not building anything, so they don't build buildings, they don't build machinery, they finance, and they have a kind of a more following role here. But even though they ask the pertinent questions and they are kind of moving non-financial institutions to quite some extent, and just a small anecdote maybe from the German market, there's at times quite some maybe let's call it a little bit of fear, and in particular by high impact or high emissions small and medium enterprises, that liquidity is going to dry up. I don't see that at the short term, but in the long term, of course, business models, as they might be affected more seriously, banks will ask questions. Okay, if the business model is still kind of feasible to work in the long term. So that is what it's right now, and we are just at the point where the financial advisors, in particular to corporates, are kind of getting to the next gear, to the next level, in order to to equip them to talk on eye level with their respective clients.
Thank you, Carsten. One other question from the questionnaire. Integrating climate-related risks screenings and FIs seems challenging. And yes, I think it is. And time and resource consuming for FI staff members. How big is the effort for the monitoring of climate-related risks? And does anyone have any advice concerning that monitoring? So I'm not sure who wants to ask that one. Is that one for Bernard or?
I can take it. Yeah. So I think what is really important is to note that, and I think here I very much agree with what Carsten mentioned, and I would like to add, an important role for financial markets and institutions is engagement. So to be in contact with their borrowers and to better understand what they are financing and what are the implications on climate. And that relates to, I call it upstream and downstream. So it depends on, are you producing a turbine for a wind park, or are you producing a turbine for some other combustion related activity? And where do you source what you need to in order to produce that turbine? So in the end, the questions that need to be asked to the borrowers will be different than a year or 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, this is simply the case, and that is maybe not something that needs to be done in terms of only monitoring, but in the first place, before the loan is assigned, you have to get the information from the borrower, from the potential borrower, as to what exactly are you trying to finance. So this is one area where banks, in my view, have a critical role to play. And when it comes to the existing portfolio and to the monitoring of an existing large portfolio, I think maybe there's less to do, because you have to have, of course, an idea of, what are the sectoral exposures, what are the geographical exposures that you have, what is the EPC criteria for your building, or how environmentally friendly is the building that you are financing. But ultimately here, I'd say, well, you need to have a good idea of what is going on there, but you don't need to know about the needs and greeds and to ask your borrowers about what you have been financing in the past 10 years. It's rather about what are you going to finance in the future, and how does this fit to what you have financed in the past. And if you concentrate on that, I think you have already a lot of things to do, and your loan officers need to certainly adopt their questionnaires to the borrowers, but this engagement is really key.
So another take, if I might, Noel, on what banks are doing. When I speak to senior executives of banks now in places like Australia or Singapore, they tell me that they see their role as helping their clients transition. So there's a whole lot of exposure, disclosure stuff they've got to do, regulatory requirements, but just in terms of the essence of the bank, the banks are now saying, actually, the world is changing and is going to change. If I'm going to maintain my business and ensure it grows, I need to ensure my clients are engaged and understand. I've got one bank in New York who has done forward scenarios for what the businesses they bank should look like in 10 years' time, and takes those out. They tell them, now, the bank, the organizations, the corporations, clients have to make their own decision about the future. But you've got major banks now briefing their clients on the natures of transitions coming forward and how to stay ahead of it and make money in that context. That's the key role for me for the financial institutions going forward, changing the lending practices, the underwriting practices, all the business to acknowledge and to take advantage of the changes to the system. Now, in the region, I'm going to say Singaporean banks have now done this. They've hired consultants, they've started doing this. They're in the middle of the change. Malaysian banks are starting. They're starting on this journey. In other areas, it's very patchy in terms of who's across this. But there is no doubt that is what is going to happen to the whole banking sector. There's an understanding of the risks facing your clients and how to support them through the management of those risks going forward. The conversation we've been having today, essentially, is becoming visible. I have this conversation in Japan, I have this conversation in India, and I certainly have this conversation in other parts of the world, like the US and Europe. So that's quite a different role for a bank, right? Because a bank, in a sense, in the past, has been a bit reactive to the needs of corporations. But if a bank is going to manage its risk going forward, it kind of needs to be proactive. It doesn't want to abandon clients. It wants to keep those clients close to the chest, but it needs to share the knowledge it's got, prodded by central banks sometimes, with those clients to ensure they remain profitable. That's really the game.
Yeah, I think that's right. You're right. That's what that's what we're doing as well. But can I just go back and drill down, perhaps a bit more technical with Bernhard? You talked about a client questionnaires, etc. But what about tools that might be available in terms of climate risk that could help banks do their screening? And I'm thinking of risk tools, off-the-shelf risk tools.
Well, I think in general the risk tools are twofold. One that considers rather the mitigation aspect, and the other one rather the adaptation aspect. On the mitigation aspect, I'd say what is available in terms of tools is sector-based analysis and studies and models that tell you more about where do I actually observe a risk of high carbon intensity related to my business model. And that's always something that you need to be aware of, be it in the direct operation of the company or be it somewhere indirectly related to the company's activity. I think this is something where banks can also resort to external information, or where they can make use of existing models. When it comes to adaptation, I think it's getting more difficult because here we talk about very local circumstances. So let's assume you have an extreme weather event in a certain region because there is a river flooding, and we've seen that in Germany as well 2 years ago. Then you have a local event and you have a local impact, and the local impact is there are defaults on the corporate side, but also on the household side, because people are not insured, so they lose their house, and maybe the bank has a problem with the financing. Here, what we really need is more data that can better assess the risk that the bank is exposed to with regards to such local events. And I think here we don't have much, unfortunately, but maybe the banks themselves have more because they know about the, let's say, pertinent weather events that they are facing, and maybe what then has to be linked to that is more like regional or global information about what would happen if temperature increases more, to the probability that these weather events materialize, and what will happen then to my expected losses from such events, right? But the loss from the events itself is something that is probably already in the historical data of default rates in those banks, while what is not there is the projection of the increased probability of having those events. But if you link those two, I think you have a proper tool to better understand the evolving risk from climate change when it comes to those physical risks that we spoke about.
Thanks, Bert. There's a few questions in the chat, but there's one that relates to what you're talking about now, which is, it's from NMB Bank, and it's what would be the to-do list for banks to develop a climate risk assessment approach? I think I'm paraphrasing the question correctly.
Yeah, well, again, I think in the first place, what banks need is a probability distribution of the higher likelihood to have extreme weather events in the regions where they land. So this is the first. I think this is the first data point you need when you want to assess physical risks. You need to get a better idea of what is the probability of having those events, and that is maybe data that you can get from a research institution, that you can get from professional client scientists who do that. And then you need to link this information again to the history of your own loss experience when these events happened. And I think that's something where you have more rich data than anybody else, because we know that in a number of Asian countries, they were already exposed to a number of those weather events with the typical outcomes, namely defaults among corporates and also among household borrowers who lost their homes. So in this regard, I think linking these two types of data could already lead to clearly better understanding of the climate risks that you are exposed to. And again, it's local, so you need to be aware of whether there's a river close by, whether it's higher risk of experiencing storms in some regions. So geography in local conditions play a major role here, in my understanding.
And then maybe I'd add to that, need to have either resources or access to resources that understand this area, that have the capacity to work through this. And I think there's a whole bunch of tools and processes that a bank needs to embed into its own processes. So I think they're important to-do lists as well, if I can just jump in there.
Yeah, see, maybe just briefly, see,
Sure.
what we observe is that, say, convincing client-facing colleagues is quite a stretch, because it means that more time has to be spent on understanding and discussing the respective issues. That is a cost issue as well, and it's a knowledge issue. And in many cases, there's, at least what I perceive, there's quite some reluctance by financial institutions to confront clients with respective issues. maybe it's related to to the competition, so that maybe kind of the neighboring financial institution is not yet doing it, and say kind of being the first mover in this respect might be perceived as maybe too much to ask from clients in the first place. That's maybe similar to what we've seen in maybe more developed countries as well in the first place. Now we are at a stage where at least quite a substantial part of clients actually appreciate having those discussions with their financial institution. So in that respect, there's some behavioral issues in this as well that need to be overcome. And in this respect, if you would ask me for my one piece of advice, the tone from the top is essentially crucial.
So that's interesting, Carsten, because you've just done a perfect segue to the other question in the chat, which is in many cases, conventional investments are the core business, and not all activities can be transformed into sustainable in the future. So what would you suggest be the strategy to deal with those clients?
Shall I or Sean?
I don't mind who answers. It could be one for Sean or it could be one for Carsten. So
yeah, I'd say maybe I kick it off, and then I would be really keen on listening to Sean to this extent. So actually, it's a big challenge now, because there's kind of profits are made with kind of the traditional businesses, sometimes more, sometimes less. So having a plan, a transition plan, say like I tried to outline that there's a kind of decarbonization pathway and a target setting, kind of on the highest level of the institution that is published as well, is key. And that is what we currently see with big financial institutions like in the UK, like in other European countries, that outline on a sectoral level what the objectives are with respect to reducing emissions. And this is not just going automatically, that needs specific efforts. And then we are back to, okay, what is the tool set for that? And in some cases, it's even about, okay, taking some time, trying to engage with clients and to see what the business model is going to be, the strategic perspective of a respective client is going to be, so that the bank can actually essentially be part of the transformation of that respective client. I think that is crucial, but there is kind of that can't go forever. No? So there's a point in time when that has to, when a bank, if it wants to be true to its own objectives, it needs to take action, and that can mean to leave business to others. Well, that is not solving the problem, because then still those economic activities might get financed from some maybe less so from places in the financial systems that are not that kind of keen for, say, public scrutiny. But see, there's not too many other things that can be done in that respect. No? So it needs conviction by the upper levels.
Thanks, Carsten.
I'm going to frame a slightly different, Noel, if I may, which is just before there is.
Just before you go, we're out of time, so if you can add something, and I'm sure it'll be really valuable, but just really try and make it, 1 minute if that's possible.
The message for banks: there are compliance issues coming through. That's a lot of what Bernard and Carsten have been identifying, and that's going to change. So the risk side of the bank is going to have to get on top of that. But what is a bank essentially? It's a risk arbitrage entity. It looks at different risks. It helps its clients and makes its own bets on based on a more informed understanding of risk going forward about where money's going to be made. That's really what it is. What we're really saying from the point of view of a bank's business is, hey, there's a whole new package of risks here and opportunities as a result of risk, because of course there's risk everywhere. There's no shortage of risk. Admittedly, there's a rather big lump of risk coming through, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is understand what's happening and figure out how to manage the risk arbitrage for you and your clients and make money out of it. We only see the change if everyone's going to be able to make this financially viable. And there are incredible opportunities to work with your clients and with your businesses to take advantage of the change, which is now certain to happen. That's really what it's about.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. Look, really, really valuable contributions from everyone. I'm going to hand it back to Sabine now to wrap up. So thank you all.
Yes, thanks everyone for the panels, and thanks Noel also for moderating this session. I think we have heard so many different perspectives, and 1.5 hours have passed very quickly, and I'm sure we could discuss a lot longer on these different aspects that we heard today in terms of climate risk assessments, screening, how this could be done and what needs to be done, but then also looking at opportunities on products and how we can help clients to transition into a more greener economy, or also from Sean then to hear about what the capital market can do and is out there to help financing what we need to do in the next couple of years. So I think we need to take time next year to do another series of these seminars with different topics, because I do think this is very complex, and my head spinning from all the information I have actually received today. I'm not sure if everyone else has sort of this the same, but I'd be very happy, and that's for the audience, to do another series of these webinars, different topics, and so we were happy to have your feedback on what you would like to hear. So I'll want to close this. We are also almost closing to coming into December, so you all have a very nice festive season ahead of you, wherever you are. And thank you very much again for the speakers to provide their insights, and Noel for this interesting session. Thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.